The Mysterious Visitor by R. Austin Freeman. So, said Thorndyke, looking at me reflectively, you're a full-blown medical practitioner with a practice of your own. How the years slip by. It seems but the other day that you were a student gaping at me from the front bench of the lecture theatre. Did I gape? I asked incredulously. I use the word metaphorically, said he, to denote ostentatious attention. You always took my lectures very seriously. May I ask if you have ever found them of use in your practice? I can't say that I've ever had any very thrilling medico-legal experiences since that extraordinary cremation case that you investigated, the case of Septimus Maddock, you know. But that reminds me that there is a little matter that I meant to speak to you about. It is of no interest, but I just wanted your advice, though it isn't even my business, strictly speaking. It concerns a patient of mine, a man named Crofton, who has disappeared rather unaccountably. And do you call that a case of no medical legal interest? Demanded Thorndyke. Oh, there's nothing in it. He just went for a holiday and he hasn't communicated with his friends very recently. That's all. What makes me a little uneasy is that there is a departure from his usual habits. He is generally a fairly regular correspondent. That seems a little significant in view of his personality. He is markedly neurotic, and his family history is by no means what one would wish. That is an admirable thumbnail sketch, Jardine, said Thorndyke, but it lacks detail. Let us have a full-size picture. Very well, said I, but you mustn't let me bore you. To begin with, Crofton, he is a nervous, anxious, worrying sort of fellow, everlastingly fussing about money affairs, and latterly this tendency has been getting worse. He fairly got the jumps about his financial position, felt that he was steadily drifting into bankruptcy, and couldn't get the subject out of his mind. It was all bunkum. I'm more or less a friend of the family, and I know that there was nothing to worry about. Mrs. Crofton assured me that, although they were a trifle hard up, they could rub along quite safely. As he seemed to be getting the hump worse and worse, I advised him to go away for a change and stay in a boarding house where he could see some fresh faces. Instead of that, he elected to go down to a bungalow that he has at Sea Salter near Whitstable, and lets out in the season. He proposed to stay by himself and spend his time in sea bathing and country walks. I wasn't very keen on this, for solitude was the last thing that he wanted. There was a strong family history of melancholia and some unpleasant rumors of suicide. I didn't like his being alone at all. However, another friend of the family, Mrs. Crofton's brother in fact, a chap named Ambrose, offered to go down and spend a weekend with him to give him a start, and afterwards to run down for an afternoon whenever he was able. So off he went with Ambrose on Friday the 16th of June, and for a time all went well. He seemed to be improving in health and spirits, and wrote to his wife regularly 2 or 3 times a week. Ambrose went down as often as he could to cheer him up, and the last time brought back the news that Crofton thought of moving on to Margate for a further change, so of course he didn't go down to the bungalow again. Well, in due course, a letter came from Margate. It had been written at the bungalow, but the postmark was Margate and bore the same date, the 16th of July, as the letter itself. I have it with me. Mrs. Crofton sent it for me to see, and I haven't returned it yet. But there's nothing of interest in it beyond the statement that he was going on to Margate by the next train and would write again when he had found rooms there. That was the last that was heard of him. He never wrote, and nothing is known of his movements excepting that he left Sea Salter and arrived at Margate. This is a letter. I handed it to Thorndyke, who glanced at the postmark and then laid it on the table for examination later. Have any inquiries been made? He asked. Yes, his photograph has been sent to the Margate police, but of course, well, you know what Margate is like in July. Thousands of strangers coming and going every day. It's hopeless to look for him in that crowd, and it's quite possible that he isn't there now. But his disappearance is most inopportune. for a big legacy has just fallen in, and naturally Mrs. Crofton is frantically anxious to let him know. It's a matter of about £30,000. Was this legacy expected? Asked Thorndyke. No, the Croftons knew nothing about it. They didn't know that the old lady, Miss Schuyler, had made a will or that she had very much to leave, and they didn't know that she was likely to die or even that she was ill, which is rather odd, for she was ill for a month or two. And as she suffered from a malignant abdominal tumor, it was known that she couldn't recover. When did she die? On the 13th of July. Thorndyke raised his eyebrows. Just 3 days before the date of this letter, he remarked, so that if he should never reappear, this letter will be the sole evidence that he survived her. It's an important document. It may come to represent a value of £30,000. It isn't really so important as it looks, said I. Miss Schuyler's will provides that if Crofton should die before the testatrix, the legacy should go to his wife. So, whether he's alive or not, the legacy is quite safe. But we must hope that he is alive, though I must confess to some little anxiety on his account. Thorndyke reflected a while on this statement. Presently he asked, Do you know if Crofton has made a will? Yes, he has, I replied, quite recently. I was one of the witnesses and I read it through at Crofton's request. It was full of the usual legal verbiage, but it might have been stated in a dozen words. It leaves practically everything to his wife, but instead of saying so, it enumerates the property item by item. It was drafted, I suppose, by the solicitor. Yes, sir, another friend of the family named Jobson, and he is the executor and residuary legatee. Thorndyke nodded and again became deeply reflective. Still meditating, he took up the letter, and as he inspected it, I watched him curiously and not without a certain secret amusement. First he looked over the envelope, back and front. Then he took from his pocket a powerful Coddington lens, and with this examined the flap and the postmark. Next he drew out the letter, held it up to the light, then read it through, and finally examined various parts of the writing through his lens. Well, I asked with an irreverent grin, I should think you've extracted the last grain of meaning from it. He smiled as he put away his lens and handed the letter back to me. As this may have to be produced in proof of survival, said he, it had better be put in a place of safety. I notice he speaks of returning later to the bungalow. I take it that it has been ascertained that he did not return there. I don't think so. You see, they've been waiting for him to write. You think that someone ought... I paused, for it began to be borne in on me that Thorndyke was taking a somewhat gloomy view of the case. My dear Jardine, said he, I'm merely following your own suggestion. Here is a man with an inherited tendency to melancholia and suicide, who has suddenly disappeared. He went away from an empty house and announced his intention of returning to it later. As that house is the only known locality in which he could be sought, it is obvious that it ought to have been examined. And even if he never came back there, the house might contain some clues to his present whereabouts. This last sentence put an idea into my mind which I was a little shy of broaching. What was a clue to Thorndyke might be perfectly meaningless to an ordinary person. I recalled his amazing interpretations of the most commonplace facts in the mysterious Maddock case, and the idea took full possession. At length, I said tentatively, I would go down myself if I felt competent. Tomorrow is Saturday, and I could get a colleague to look after my practice. There isn't much doing just now, but when you speak of clues and when I remember what a duffer I was last time, I wish it were possible for you to have a look at the place. To my surprise, he assented almost with enthusiasm. Why not? Said he. It's a weekend. We could put up at the bungalow, I suppose, and have a little gypsy holiday. And there are undoubtedly points of interest in the case. Let's go down tomorrow. We can lunch in the train and have the afternoon before us. You had better get a key from Mrs. Crofton, or, if she hasn't got one, an authority to visit the house. We may want that if we have to enter without a key, and we go alone, of course. I assented joyfully, not that I had any expectations as to what we might learn from our inspection. But something in Thorndyke's manner gave me the impression that he had extracted from my account of the case some significance that was not apparent to me. The bungalow stood on a space of rough ground a little way behind the sea-wall, along which we walked towards it from Whitstable, passing on our way a shipbuilder's yacht and a slipway, on which a collier brigantine was hauled up for repairs. There were one or two other bungalows adjacent, but a considerable distance apart, and we looked at them as we approached to make out the names painted on the gates. "That will probably be the one," said Thorndyke, indicating a small building enclosed within a wooden fence, and provided like the others with a bathing hut just above the high water mark. Its solitary, deserted aspect and lowered blinds supported his opinion, and when we reached the gate, the name Middlewick painted on it settled the matter. "Next question is," said I, "how the deuce are we going to get in? If the gate's locked and there's no bell, is it worthwhile to hammer at the fence?" "I wouldn't do that," replied Thorndyke. "The place is pretty certainly empty or the gate wouldn't be locked. We shall have to climb over unless there's a back gate unlocked, so the less noise we make, the better." We walked round the enclosure, but there was no other gate, nor was there any tree or other cover to disguise our rather suspicious proceedings. "There's no help for it, Jardine," said Thorndyke, "so here goes." He put his green canvas suitcase on the ground, grasped the top of the fence with both hands, and went over like a harlequin. I picked up the case and handed it over to him, and having taken a quick glance round, followed my leader. "Well," I said, "here we are. And now, how are we going to get into the house?" "We shall have to pick a lock if there's no door open, or else go in by a window. But let's take a look around." We walked round the house to the back door, but found it not only locked but bolted top and bottom, as Thorndyke ascertained with his knife blade. The windows were all casements and all fastened with their catches. "The front door will be the best," said Thorndyke. "It can't be bolted unless he got out by the chimney. And I think my smoker's companion will be able to cope with an ordinary door lock. It looked like a common builder's fitting." As he spoke, we returned to the front of the house, and he produced the smoker's companion from his pocket. I don't know what kind of smoker it was designed to accompany. The lock was apparently a simple affair, for the second trial with the companion shot back the bolt, and when I turned the handle, the door opened. As a precaution, I called out to inquire if there's anybody within, and then, as there was no answer, we entered, walking straight into the living room, as there was no hall or lobby. A couple of paces from the threshold, we halted to look round the room, and on me the aspect of the place produced a vague sense of discomfort. Though it was early on a bright afternoon, the room was almost completely dark, for not only were the blinds lowered, but the curtains were drawn as well. "It looks," said I, peering about the dim and gloomy apartment with sun-dazzled eyes, "as if he had gone away at night. He wouldn't have drawn the curtains in the daytime." "One would think not," Thorndyke agreed, "but it doesn't follow." He stepped to the front window, and drawing back the curtains, pulled up the blind, revealing a half-curtain of green serge over the lower part of the window. As the bright daylight flooded the room, he stood with his back to the window, looking about with deep attention, letting his eyes travel slowly over the walls, the furniture, and, especially, the floor. Presently he stooped to pick up a short match end which lay just under the table opposite the door, and as he looked at it thoughtfully, he pointed to a couple of spots of candle grease on the linoleum near the table. Then he glanced at the mantelpiece, and from that to an ash bowl on the table. "These are only trifling discrepancies," said he, "but they are worth noting. You see," he continued in response to my look of inquiry, "that this room is severely trim and orderly. Everything seems to be in its place. The matchbox, for instance, has its fixed receptacle above the mantelpiece, and there's a bowl for the burnt matches, regularly used as its contents show. Yet here is a burnt match thrown on the floor, although the bowl is on the table quite handy. and the match you notice is not the same kind as those in the box over the mantelpiece, which is a large Bryant and May, or as the burnt matches in the bowl which have evidently come from it. But if you look in the bowl, he continued, picking it up, you will see 2 burnt matches of this same kind, apparently the small size Bryant and May. One burned quite short and the other only half burnt. The suggestion is fairly obvious, but as I say, there is a slight discrepancy. I don't know, said I, that either the suggestion or the discrepancy is very obvious to me. He walked over to the mantelpiece and took the matchbox from its case. You see, said he, opening it, that this box is nearly full. It has an appointed place, and it was in that place. We find a small match burnt right out under the table opposite the door, and 2 more in the bowl under the hanging lamp. A reasonable inference is that someone came in the dark and struck a match as he entered. That match must have come from a box that he brought with him in his pocket. It burned out, and he struck another, which also burned out while he was raising the chimney of the lamp, and he struck a third to light the lamp. But if that person was Crofton, why did he need to strike a match to light the room when the matchbox was in its usual place? And why did he throw the match end on the floor? You mean that the suggestion is that the person was not Crofton? And I think you're right. Crofton doesn't carry matches in his pocket. He uses wax vestas and carries them in a silver case. It might possibly have been Ambrose, Thorndyke suggested. I don't think so, said I. Ambrose uses a petrol lighter. Thorndyke nodded. There may be nothing in it, said he, but it offers a suggestion. Shall we look over the rest of the premises? He paused for a moment to glance at a small keyboard on the wall, on which 1 or 2 keys were hanging, each distinguished by a little ivory label and by the name written underneath the peg. Then he opened a door in the corner of the room. As this led into the kitchen, he closed it and opened an adjoining room, which gave access to a bedroom. This is probably the extra bedroom, he remarked as we entered. The blinds have not been drawn down, and there is a general air of trimness that suggests a tidy up of an unoccupied room, and the bed looks as if it had been out of use. After an attentive look round, he returned to the living room and crossed to the remaining door. As he opened it, we looked into a nearly dark room, both the windows being covered by thick serge curtains. Well, he observed, when he had drawn back the curtains and raised the blinds, there's nothing painfully tidy here. This is a very roughly made bed, and the blanket is outside the counterpane. He looked critically about the room, and especially at the bedside table. Here are some more discrepancies, said he. There are 2 candlesticks, in one of which the candle has burned itself right out, leaving a fragment of wick. There are 5 burnt matches in it, 2 large ones from the box by its side and 3 small ones, of which 2 are mere stumps. The second candle is very much gutted, and I think he lifted it out of its socket. Yes, it's been used out of the candlestick. You see that the grease has run right down to the bottom, and there's a distinct impression of a thumb, apparently a left thumb, made while the grease was warm. Then you notice the mark on the table of a tumbler which had contained some liquid that was not water, but there is no tumbler. However, it may be an old mark, though it looks fresh. It's hardly like Crofton to leave an old mark on the table, said I. He's a regular old maid. We had better see if the tumbler is in the kitchen. Yes, agreed Thorndyke. But I wonder what he was doing with that candle. Apparently he took it out of doors, as there is a spot on the floor of the living room, and you see that there are 1 or 2 spots on the floor here. He walked over to a chest of drawers near the door, and was looking into a drawer which he had pulled out, and which I could see was full of clothes, when I observed a faint smile spreading over his face. Come round here, Jardine, he said in a low voice, and take a peep through the crack of the door. I walked round, and applying my eye to the crack, I looked across the living room at the end window. Above the half curtain I could distinguish the unmistakable top of a constabulary helmet. Listen, said Thorndyke, they are in force. As he spoke, there came from the neighborhood of the kitchen a furtive scraping sound, suggestive of a pocket knife persuading a window catch. It was followed by the sound of an opening window and then of a stealthy entry. Finally, the kitchen door opened softly. Someone tiptoed across the living room, and a burly police sergeant appeared framed in the bedroom doorway. "Good afternoon, Sergeant," said Thorndyke with a genial smile. "Yes, that's all very well," was the response, "but the question is, who might you be, and what might you be doing in this house?" Thorndyke briefly explained our business, and when we had presented our cards and Mrs. Crofton's written authority, the sergeant's professional stiffness vanished like magic. "It's all right, Tompkins," he sang out to an invisible myrmidon. "You had better shut the window and go out by the front door. You must excuse me, gentlemen," he added, "but the tenant of the next bungalow cycled down and gave us the tip. He watched you through his glasses and saw you pick the front door lock. It did look a bit queer, you must admit." Thorndyke admitted it freely with a faint chuckle, and we walked across the living room to the kitchen. Here the sergeant's presence seemed to inhibit comments, but I noticed that my colleague cast a significant glance at a frying pan that rested on a Primus stove. The congealed fat in it presented another discrepancy, for I could hardly imagine the fastidious Crofton going away and leaving it in that condition. Noting that there was no unwashed tumbler in evidence, I followed my friend back to the living room, where he paused with his eye on the keyboard. "Well," remarked the sergeant, "if he ever did come back here, it's pretty clear that he isn't here now. You've been all over the premises, I think?" "All except the bathing hut," replied Thorndyke, and as he spoke he lifted the key so labeled from its hook. The sergeant laughed softly. "He's not very likely to have taken up his quarters there," said he. "Still, there's nothing like being thorough. But you notice that the key of the front door and that of the gate have both been taken away, so we can assume that he has taken himself away too." "That is a reasonable inference," Thorndyke admitted, "but we may as well make our survey complete." With this he led the way out into the garden and to the gate, where he unblushingly produced the smoker's companion and insinuated its prongs into the keyhole. "Well, I'm sure," exclaimed the sergeant as the lock clicked and the gate opened. "That's a funny sort of tool, and you seem quite handy with it too. Might I have a look at it?" He looked at it so very long and attentively, when Thorndyke handed it to him, that I suspected him of an intention to infringe the patent. By the time he had finished his inspection, we were at the bottom of the bank below the seawall, and Thorndyke had inserted the key into the lock of the bathing hut. As the sergeant returned the companion, Thorndyke took it and pocketed it. Then he turned the key and pushed the door open, and the officer started back with a shout of amazement. It was certainly a grim spectacle that we looked in on. The hut was a small building about 6 feet square, devoid of any furniture or fittings excepting 1 or 2 pegs high up on the wall. The single unglazed window was closely shuttered, and on the bare floor in the farther corner, a man was sitting, leaning back into the corner, with his head dropped forward on his breast. The man was undoubtedly Arthur Crofton. That much I could say with certainty, notwithstanding the horrible changes wrought by death and the lapse of time. But, I added, when I had identified the body, I should have said that he had been dead more than a fortnight. He must have come straight back from Margate and done this, and that will probably be the missing tumbler, I concluded, pointing to one that stood on the floor close to the right hand of the corpse. "No doubt," replied Thorndyke, somewhat abstractedly. He had been looking critically about the interior of the hut, and now remarked, "I wonder why he didn't shoot the bolt instead of locking himself in, and what has become of the key? He must have taken it out of the lock and put it into his pocket." He looked interrogatively at the sergeant, who, having no option but to take the hint, advanced with an expression of horrified disgust, and proceeded very gingerly to explore the dead man's clothing. "Ah!" he exclaimed at length, "here we are." He drew from the waistcoat pocket a key with a small ivory label attached to it. "Yes, this is the one. You see it's marked Bathing Hut." He handed it to Thorndyke, who looked at it attentively and even with an appearance of surprise, and then, producing an indelible pencil from his pocket, wrote on the label, "Found on the body." "The first thing," said he, "is to ascertain if it fits the lock." "Why, it must," said the sergeant, "if he locked himself in with it." "Undoubtedly," Thorndyke agreed, "but that is the point. It doesn't look quite similar to the other one." He drew out the key which we had brought from the house and gave it to me to hold. Then he tried the key from the dead man's pocket, but it not only did not fit, it would not even enter the keyhole. The skeptical indifference faded suddenly from the sergeant's face. He took the key from Thorndyke, and having tried it with the same result, stood up and stared round-eyed at my colleague. "Well," he exclaimed, "this is a facer. It's the wrong key." "There may be another key on the body," said Thorndyke. "It isn't likely, but you'd better make sure." The sergeant showed no reluctance this time. He searched the dead man's pockets thoroughly and produced a bunch of keys, but they were all quite small keys, none of them in the least resembling that of the hut door. Nor, I noticed, did they include those of the bungalow door or the garden gate. Once more the officer drew himself up and stared at Thorndyke. "There's something rather fishy about this affair," said he. "There is," Thorndyke agreed. "The door was certainly locked, and it was not locked from within. It must have been locked from without. Then that key, the wrong key, was presumably put in the dead man's pocket by some other person. And there are some other suspicious facts. A tumbler has disappeared from the bedside table, and there is a tumbler here. You notice one or two spots of candle grease on the floor here, and it looks as if a candle had been stood in the corner near the door. There is no candle here now, but in the bedroom there is a candle, which has been carried without a candlestick, and which, by the way, bears an excellent impression of a thumb. The first thing to do will be to take the deceased fingerprints. Would you mind fetching my case from the bedroom, Jardine?" I ran back to the house, not unobserved by the gentleman in the next bungalow, and, catching up the case, carried it down to the hut. When I arrived there, I found Thorndyke holding the tumbler delicately in his gloved left hand, while he examined it against the light with the aid of his lens. He handed the latter to me and observed, "If you look at this carefully, Jardine, you'll see a very interesting thing. There are the prints of two different thumbs, both left thumbs and therefore of different persons. You remember that the tumbler stood by the right hand of the body, and that the table, which bore the mark of a tumbler, was at the left-hand side of the bed. When I had examined the thumbprints, he placed the tumbler carefully on the floor and opened his research case, which is fitted as a sort of portable laboratory. From this he took a little brass box containing an ink tube, a tiny roller, and some small cards, and using the box lid as an inking plate, he proceeded methodically to take the dead man's fingerprints, writing the particulars on each card. "I don't quite see what you want with Crofton's fingerprints," said I. "The other man's would be more to the point." "Undoubtedly," Thorndyke replied, "but we have to prove that they are another man's, that they're not Crofton's. And there is that print on the candle. That is a very important point to settle. And as we have finished here, we had better go and settle it at once." He closed his case, and taking up the tumbler with his gloved hand, led the way back to the house, the sergeant following, when he had locked the door. We proceeded direct to the bedroom, where Thorndyke took the candle from its socket, and with the aid of his lens compared it carefully with the two thumbprints on the card and then with the tumbler. "It is perfectly clear," said he. "This is a mark of a left thumb. It's totally unlike Crofton's, and it appears to be identical with the strange thumbprint on the tumbler, from which it seems to follow that the stranger took the candle from this room to the hut and brought it back. But he probably blew it out before leaving the house and lit it again in the hut." The sergeant and I examined the cards, the candle, and the tumbler, and then the former asked, "I suppose you have no idea whose thumbprint that might be? You don't know, for instance, of anyone who might have had any motive for making away with Mr. Crofton?" "That," replied Thorndyke, "is rather a question for the coroner's jury, but so it is," the sergeant agreed. But there won't be much question about their verdict. It's a pretty clear case of willful murder." To this Thorndyke made no reply, excepting to give some directions as to the safekeeping of the candle and tumbler. And our proposed gypsy holiday being now evidently impossible, we took our leave of the sergeant, who already had our cards, and wended back to the station. "I suppose," said I, "we shall have to break the news to Mrs. Crofton." "That's hardly our business," he replied. "We can leave that to the solicitor or to Ambrose. If you know the lawyer's address, you might send him a telegram, arranging a meeting at 8 o'clock tonight. Give no particulars, just say, 'Crofton found,' but mark the telegram urgent so that he'll keep the appointment." On reaching the station, I sent off the telegram. Very soon afterwards the London train was signalled. It turned out to be a slow train, which gave us ample time to discuss the case, and me ample time for reflection. And in fact, I reflected a good deal, for there was a rather uncomfortable question in my mind. The very question that the sergeant had raised, and that Thorndyke had obviously evaded. Was there anyone who might have had a motive for making away with Crofton? It was an awkward question when one remembered the great legacy that had just fallen in, and the terms of Miss Schuyler's will, which expressly provided that if Crofton died before his wife, the legacy should go to her. Now Ambrose was the wife's brother, and Ambrose had been in the bungalow alone with Crofton, and nobody else was known to have been there at all. I meditated on these facts uncomfortably, and would have liked to put the case to Thorndyke, but his reticence, his evasion of the sergeant's question, and his decision to communicate with the solicitor rather than with the family showed pretty clearly what was in his mind, and that he did not wish to discuss the matter. Promptly at 8 o'clock, having dined at a restaurant, we presented ourselves at the solicitor's house, and were shown into the study, where we found Mr. Jobson seated at a writing table. He looked at Thorndyke with some surprise, and, when the introductions had been made, said somewhat dryly, "We may take it that Dr. Thorndyke is in some way connected with our rather confidential business." "Certainly," I replied, "that is why he's here." Jobson nodded. "And how is Crofton?" he asked. "And where did you dig him up?" Sorry to say," I replied, "that he's dead. It's a dreadful affair. We found the body locked in the bathing hut. He was sitting in a corner with a tumbler on the floor by his side." "Horrible, horrible!" exclaimed the solicitor. "He ought never to have gone there alone. I said, sir, at the time. And it is most unfortunate on account of the insurance, though that is not a large amount. Still, the suicide clause, you know." "I doubt whether the insurance will be affected," said Thorndyke. "The coroner's finding will almost certainly be willful murder." Jobson was thunderstruck. In a moment his face grew livid, and he gazed at Thorndyke with an expression of horrified amazement. "Murder?" he replied incredulously. "But you said he was locked in the hut. Surely that is clear proof of suicide." "He hadn't locked himself in, you know. There was no key inside." "Ah!" The solicitor spoke almost in a tone of relief. "But perhaps, did you examine his pockets?" "Yes, and we found a key labeled bathing hut, but it was the wrong key. It wouldn't go into the lock. There's no doubt whatever that the door's locked from the outside." "Good God!" exclaimed Jobson in a faint voice. "He does look suspicious, but still I can't believe it. Seems quite incredible." "That may be," said Thorndyke, "but it is all perfectly clear. There is evidence that the stranger entered the bungalow at night, and that the affair took place in the bedroom. From thence, the stranger carried the body down to the hut, and he also took a tumbler and a candle from the bedside table. By the light of the candle, which was stood on the floor of the hut in the corner, he arranged the body, having put into its pocket a key from the board in the living room. Then he locked the hut, went back to the house, put the key on its peg and the candle in its candlestick. Then he locked up the house and the garden gate, and took the keys away with him." The solicitor listened to this recital in speechless amazement. At length he asked, "How long ago do you suppose this happened?" "Apparently on the night of the 15th of this month," was the reply. "But," objected Jobson, He wrote him on the 16th. He wrote, said Thorndyke, on the 6th. Someone put a 1 in front of the 6 and posted the letter at Margate on the 16th. I shall give evidence to that effect at the inquest. I was becoming somewhat mystified. Thorndyke's dry, stern manner, so different from his usual suavity, and the solicitor's uncalled-for agitation, seemed to hint at something more than met the eye. I watched Jobson as he lit a cigarette. With a small Bryant and May match which he threw on the floor, and listened expectantly for his next question. At length he asked, "Was there any sort of clue as to who this stranger might be? The man who will be charged with the murder?" "Oh yes, the police have the means of identifying him with absolute certainty. That is, if they can find him," said Jobson. "Naturally. But when all the very remarkable facts have transpired at the inquest, that individual will probably come pretty clearly into view." Jobson continued to smoke furiously, with his eyes fixed on the floor as if he were thinking hard. Presently he asked, without looking up, "Suppose they do find this man, what then? What evidence is there that he murdered Crofton?" "You mean direct evidence," said Thorndyke. I can't say, as I didn't examine the body. But the circumstantial evidence that I have given you would be enough to convict unless there was some convincing explanation other than murder. And I may say," he added, "that if the suspected person has a plausible explanation to offer, he would be well advised to produce it before he's charged. A voluntary statement has a good deal more weight than the same statement made by a prisoner in answer to a charge." There was an interval of silence, in which I looked in bewilderment from Thorndyke's stern visage to the pale face of the solicitor. At length the latter rose abruptly, and, after one or two quick strides up and down the room, halted by the fireplace, and still avoiding Thorndyke's eye, said somewhat brusquely, though in a low, husky voice, "I'll tell you how it happened. I went down to Sea Salter, as you said, on the night of the 15th, on the chance of finding Crofton at the bungalow. I wanted to tell him of Miss Schuyler's death and of the provisions of her will." "You had some private information on that subject, I presume," said Thorndyke. "Yes, my cousin was her solicitor, and he kept me informed about the will, and about the state of her health." "Yes. Well, when I arrived at the bungalow, it was in darkness. The gate and the front door were unlocked, so I entered, calling out Crofton's name. As no one answered, I struck a match and lit the lamp. Then I went into the bedroom and struck a match there, and by its light I could see Crofton lying on the bed, quite still. I spoke to him, but he did not answer or move. Then I lighted a candle on his table, and now I could see what I had already guessed, that he was dead, and that he had been dead some time, probably more than a week. It was an awful shock to find a dead man in this solitary house, and my first impulse was to rush out and give the alarm. But when I went into the living room, I happened to see a letter lying on the writing table, and noticed that it was in his own handwriting and addressed to his wife. Unfortunately, I had the curiosity to take it out of the unsealed envelope and read it. It was dated the 6th, and stated his intention of going to Margate for a time, and then coming back to the bungalow. Now, the reading of that letter exposed me to an enormous temptation. By simply putting a 1 in front of the 6, and thus altering the date from the 6th to the 16th, and posting the letter at Margate, I stood to gain £30,000. I saw that at a glance, but I did not decide immediately to do it. I pulled down all the blinds, drew the curtains, and looked up the house while I thought it over. There seemed to be practically no risk, unless someone should come to the bungalow and notice that the state of the body did not agree with the altered date on the letter. I went back and looked at the dead man. There was a burnt-out candle by his side, and a tumbler containing the dried-up remains of some brown liquid. He had evidently poisoned himself. Then it occurred to me that if I put the body and the tumbler in some place where they were not likely to be found for some time, the discrepancy between the condition of the body and the date of the letter would not be noticed. For some time I could think of no suitable place, but at last I remembered the bathing hut. No one would look there for him. If they came to the bungalow and didn't find him there, they would merely conclude that he had not come back from Margate. I took the candle and the key from the keyboard and went down to the hut. But there was a key in the door already, so I brought the other key back and put it in Crofton's pocket, and never dreaming that it might not be the duplicate. Of course, I ought to have tried it in the door. Well, you know the rest. I took the body down about 2 in the morning, locked up the hut, brought away the key and hung it on the board, took the counterpane off the bed, as it had some marks on it, and remade the bed with the blanket outside. In the morning, I took the train to Margate, pasted the letter, after altering the date, and threw the gate key and that of the front door into the sea. That is what really happened. You may not believe me, but I think you will as you have seen the body, and will realize that I had no motive for killing Crofton before the 15th, whereas Crofton evidently died before that date. I would not say evidently, said Thorndyke, but as the date of his death is the vital point in your defense, you would be wise to notify the coroner of the importance of the issue. I don't understand this case, I said, as we walked homewards. I was spending the evening with Thorndyke. You seem to smell a rat from the very first, and I don't see how you spotted Jobson. It's a mystery to me. It wouldn't be if you were a lawyer, he replied. The case against Jobson was contained in what you told me at our first interview. You yourself commented on the peculiarity of the will that he drafted for Crofton. The intention of the latter was to leave all his property to his wife, but instead of saying so, the will specified each item of property and appointed a residuary legatee, which was Johnson himself. This might have appeared like mere legal verbiage, but when Miss Schuyler's legacy was announced, the transaction took on a rather different aspect, for this legacy was not among the items specified in the will. Therefore, it did not go to Mrs. Crofton. It would be included in the residue of the estate and would go to the residuary legatee, Jobson. The deuce it would, I exclaimed. Certainly, until Crofton revoked his will or made a fresh one. This was rather suspicious. It suggested that Jobson had private information as to Miss Schuyler's will, and had drafted Crofton's will in accordance with it. And as she died of malignant disease, her doctor must have known for some time that she was dying, and it looked as if Jobson had information on that point too. Now, the position of affairs that you described to me was this: Crofton, a possible suicide, had disappeared, and had made no fresh will. Miss Schuyler died on the 13th, leaving £30,000 to Crofton, if he survived her, or if he did not, then to Mrs. Crofton. The important question then was whether Crofton was alive or dead, and if he was dead, whether he had died before or after the 13th, for if he died before the 13th, the legacy went to Mrs. Crofton, but if he died after that date, the legacy went to Jobson. Then you showed me that extraordinarily opportune letter dated the 16th. Now, seeing that date was worth £30,000 to Jobson, I naturally scrutinized it narrowly. The letter was written with ordinary blue-black ink, but this ink, even in the open, takes about a fortnight to blacken completely. In a closed envelope it takes considerably longer. On examining this date through a lens, the 1 was very perceptibly bluer than the 6. It had therefore been added later, but for what reason, and by whom? The only possible reason was that Crofton was dead and had died before the 13th. The only person who had any motive for making the alteration was Jobson. Therefore, when we started for Sea Salter, I already felt sure that Crofton was dead, and that the letter had been posted at Margate by Jobson. I had further no doubt that Crofton's body was concealed somewhere on the premises of the bungalow. All that I had to do was to verify these conclusions. Then, you believe that Jobson has told us the truth? Yes, but I suspect that he went down there with the deliberate intention of making away with Crofton before he could make a fresh will. The finding of Crofton's body must have been a fearful disappointment, but I must admit that he showed considerable resource in dealing with the situation, and he failed only by the merest chance. I think his defense against the murder charge will be admitted, but of course, it will involve a plea of guilty to the charge of fraud in connection with the legacy. Thorndyke's forecast turned out to be correct. Jobson was acquitted of the murder of Arthur Crofton, but is at present doing time in respect of the forged letter and the rest of his too ingenious scheme. So now I'm going to say something about the story and the author. So that was The Mysterious Visitor by R. Austin Freeman. So Richard Austin Freeman was born in 1862, which seems a tremendously long time ago, about 100 years before Sheila on April 11th. She was born in June. In 1862, as I said, in Soho, London. And he's known as a detective fiction writer, and his creation as Sherlock Holmes is for Conan Doyle is Dr. John Evelyn Thorndyke. He himself was a doctor. He studied at Middlesex Hospital and became a medical doctor in 1886. And so his detective stories have this real emphasis on forensic science and logical deduction. So his medical career took him to the Gold Coast, which is Ghana these days, as part of the British Colonial Service, where he served as a doctor. However, health issues and the strong aversion to the tropical climate led him to return to England, where he found when he started to write. He began co-authoring stories with John James Pitcairn using a pseudonym Clifford Ashdown, and they wrote The Adventures of Romney Pringle. I don't know that one. But it was then the debut novel with Dr. Thorndyke, The Red Thumb Mark, 1907, that introduced this particular medical legal style, this medical legal expert who becomes, now, a slight digression, coroners. Coroners in the system which is inherited English law, those parts of the world, English common law, you can be a doctor or a lawyer to be a coroner. The truth is, in the USA, most coroners are doctors, whereas in England, most coroners are lawyers. But we have actually got one who's a doctor, which is unusual. And I used to have a lot to do with coroners when I worked in mental health, sadly, due to the deaths of patients. Sounds terrible. It was terrible. So anyway, so I'm very interested in this medical legal stuff anyway. So Thorndyke himself is he's not as quirky, certainly in the stories I've read, he hasn't come out in the same way as Holmes, as being very quirky, but he is he's not as tetchy either, and he's quite an affable geezer, if one I should give him, he using that word, but he is very methodical and very logical. Scientific accuracy in forensic methods. So we see all these fancy forensic methods coming out, like fingerprints, but also his minute observation of the matches, the candle wax, the keyboard, not a keyboard, but a keyboard, and you can see all that deduction. And actually, R. Austin Freeman continued to write prolifically until his death on September 28, 1943. And he actually wrote several non-fiction on the intersection of medicine and the law. So, The Mysterious Visitor, as you know, is a short story, and that's a key point. It's a short story. That may sound nonsensical, but I'll come back to it. By Austin Freeman, as we know, featuring Dr. John Thorndyke, as we know. The story was first published in 1938 as part of a collection titled The Best Dr. Thorndyke Detective Stories, released by Dodd Mead and Company in New York. And I'm guessing somebody in London as well. Since its initial publication, it's been anthologized very much and appeared in collections of his work. He'd been writing Thorndyke stories since 1907, as we know, with the novel The Red Thumb Mark, and we don't know exactly when The Mysterious Visitor was written, but I would say from some of the factors in it, it was written probably in the 30s. I'll tell you why I think that, and it's to do with bungalows by the sea. Let me just digress onto those because they're very interesting. I went out with a girl whose family had one of these, and when they say the bungalows, they're like they're not shacks, they're a bit nicer than shacks. They have a number of rooms, but they're usually built of wood, and they're usually by the seaside. And her family had one that they'd inherited down from her grandmother, who may have built it, and that was at Newgale in Pembrokeshire. Now, we used to go on holiday near where I live, at Allenby on the Cumberland coast, and they were there as well. And what happened was, in the 1920s and 30s, there was a boom in the development of affordable seaside bungalows marketed as holiday homes, but these bungalows were often very basic, prefabricated structures containing just a few small rooms, and builders promoted them as investment properties, highlighting the potential rental income. Now, the big issue is, by the time I'm involved in them in the 70s and 80s, they're looking a bit ramshackle. And I think they're pretty much all gone now. So they were criticized for poor design and construction quality, built quickly and cheaply with little thought given to aesthetic appeal or integration with the surrounding environment. Now, one interesting thing which you might not know if you're not from the UK is that we have had very strict planning laws. So even though you may own land and you may have money, but you are not allowed to build what you want to build without approval being given by the local council. So it has to go to the planning committee of the local council. Now, there's great room for corruption here. And, but sometimes Wonderflow will build, and if you build something and you haven't got permission, they can make you tear it down. But usually they just fine you. And I know a story of this guy who was a restaurateur and wealthy, a bit young, a bit flashy. And it was a very old sort of 17th century barn, historic, listed. And he pulled it down to build housing because he was going to make a lot of money from the houses. And they just took it as a tax, you know. He did get fined, but, it wasn't. It was okay. It was a business expense, which is a terrible shame, really. But I think at one point in my life in the early 90s, I used to work for an organization called the Campaign for the Protection of Rural Wales, which was a sister organization for the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England and Preservation of Rural England. I'm not sure. It was CPRE, we was CPRW, but the P's were different because the committees had made a decision. So, it's very constrained now. These planning laws came in because of unrestrained development in the first half of the 20th century. And amongst them were these bungalows, and they sprung up and they were often eyesores. And also the other thing I remember learning in geography was ribbon development, whereby along the main roads, miles and miles of houses would appear. So I can think of some villages near us. There's a road and there's a house on either side. And you see that in the USA a lot, and in Ireland a lot, actually. No offense to either of you, but there we are. I don't think it looks very nice. And maybe I'm just reflecting my prejudices. So this is my reason for dating the story at that time. I'm almost like Thorndyke, looking at a piece of wax, working out what it means, looking at the bungalow, working out its date from that. Yes, I could make a living as a detective. Oh, it makes me laugh at these detectives. That the police would let them just wander in and do the forensics now and take orders from them. Now, I said I'll come back to the fact that this is a short story. We know it's a short story, and what I mean by that is when you start a short story, either reading it yourself or you listening to the audiobook and you see how long it is, and you know it's going to develop and conclude within a certain period, not a long period. So with this sets us up, and certainly I'm used to saying this about ghost stories, but it's certainly true about detective stories. We know the crime has to be introduced and has to be resolved. Yeah. And there's a certain pattern, particularly in this kind of golden age of detective, whereby the crime happens, clues are poured over, the detective investigates. Then the detective, about 2/3 of the way through, has come to a conclusion, but doesn't share it with their sidekick. So Jardine, the sidekick's really important if you think about this. There was no Jardine. It would merely consist of Thorndyke mumbling to himself. There would be no drama. It wouldn't be as interesting. So if you ever writing a story with one character, you need two. You need two to have conversations, because otherwise, I mean, I think some of the old style Victorians would do this. You know, I this, and it was just all the internal monologue of the first character. But the purpose of Jardine there is to be the foil, as Holmes is for, or as Watson is for Holmes. You've got to have the sidekick so that the genius can baffle the sidekick. The sidekick standing in for you, the reader, and he can ask some questions that you might like to have asked, you know. So about 2/3 of the way through, the genius has concluded, but the sidekick is still benighted. And Agatha Christie does this famously. There's the denouement, isn't there? The making naked. And that, as in the French, and that happens usually around a table, whereby because it's a short story, the villain obligingly confesses. Now, if it was a novel or a police procedural or an 8-episode TV detective, he's not going to confess at this point. But because it's a short story, and that's my point here, and we know how this is going to happen, he's got to confess really. And there's an additional bit in this. So let me just jump back slightly. We know we're going to have met the murderer. That's another thing we need to know. So when you get to a certain point in a short story, even in a novel, by halfway you should have met the murderer. But certainly halfway through the short story. So where are we halfway through? Who have we met? We've met Jardine. Jardine and Thorndyke. That's it pretty much. We have heard of Jobson. He'd been mentioned, the solicitor. Ambrose, the sister's brother. That's a bit of a red herring, I think. I think that was deliberately put in to kind of make us suspect, could it be Ambrose? We have to have other characters or else there can be no red herrings and it's too obvious. So Ambrose is put in for that. Mrs. Crofton's in for that. But we haven't met them by halfway through, so it's becoming increasingly likely that they are not the murderer. Because we haven't met them, we have to meet them. And then there's a police sergeant. So by halfway, even just ticking over halfway, all we've met is Thorndyke, Jardine, and the police sergeant, none of whom are going to be the murderer. So the next person we meet kind of has to be the murderer. So the next person we meet is the solicitor. And I defy you, and we're now 3/4 of the way through, I defy you to have worked out that the solicitor did it. It's just so, and this is the mystery part of it, isn't it? What detective stories often do is they withhold all the facts. We don't have them. They're in the brain of the genius, who has arrived at them by logical deduction, or in fact the author put them in his head. But I defy anybody to have worked that out. Somebody maybe did. Please drop me a note, write a comment. And then, of course, because that's so complicated about why he would do it and how he did it and the dates, and he took for him but I mean, they set it up properly, but I defy you to have worked that out from what he's told you. And then, and then at the very end, the final part of this story is Jardine, everyman, still being a little puzzled. And basically, Thorndyke gives it to him in the explain it to me like I'm 7 version. And then finally we go, Oh, right. And it's the end of the story. And that's how it's constructed. How you would write one of these stories. Have I written detective stories? I've written mystery stories. And I used to do scripts for live role-playing scenarios, which there's always a mystery in those. So you basically, if you're going to write one, you know who did it, and then you work out how they did it, and then you don't tell the reader. You drop hints and you drop misdirections. We talked about that in another one about subverting our the tropes, our prejudices. So, and particularly the prejudices of it couldn't possibly be them because, or we in the case of the perfect maid, I think I've just had a mental blank there, but I think that this is ruffian guy comes up and we're like, Roger Ackroyd as well. There's this guy turns up for who he makes up to be fair. And he's an uneducated man, so prejudice must be him, other readers' prejudices, because he speaks out of Rath Carnegie's, and so he must be a criminal, or he couldn't be a woman, and then that's the misdirection, and there's not a ton of misdirection in this one. Then the Ambrose appears potentially, Mrs. Crofton appears potentially. But I think the main thing is the mystery, i.e. all the facts are there. In retrospect, because it wasn't just made up as R. Austin Freeman went along, so he knew who did it, and he knew how they did it, but he just didn't tell you. And he dropped observations that you couldn't have really worked out. But at the end, he explains them, and you go, yes, because they've already been previously mentioned. I've said many times, you cannot do a Deus Ex Machina. You cannot drop a solution at the end that you have not foreshadowed. You must foreshadow and hint at the truth, as well as misdirecting with your left hand. Point it like a stage magician. Get the attention of the reader onto something else. Play on their prejudices. Just do little magnetic. Certain items of life are more attractive. They pull our attention. Put those in. And humor or whatever, just get the attention away, drop the facts in, but do not highlight them, and at the end reveal it, and then they go, the facts, yes. Whereas if you don't put the facts in at all, they're like, that was a load of rubbish. Yeah, and that's true. So get writing the mysteries. Nobody writes them like these easy. Nobody has to get horribly butchered. Doesn't have to be any body gore. Doesn't have to be